Welcome to the final section of the National Constitution Center's newest exhibit, the 19th Amendment, How Women Won the Vote. Hi everyone, my name is Elena Popchak, and I'm the exhibition developer here at the center. In this final section, Winning the Vote, we cover the final few years of the movement, from 1917 to 1920, when the 19th Amendment was ratified. Behind me, you'll see one of the tactics that suffragists started to use in 1917. They actually started to picket the White House. This was the first the nation had ever seen. And they were trying to place pressure on President Wilson to announce his support for women's suffrage. And ultimately, they endured all types of weather conditions. You see the women featured here are wearing their raincoats. So they stayed out here day and night, no matter the weather, trying to encourage Wilson to support a constitutional amendment for women's suffrage. They also staged watchfires of freedom, as you'll see the fire pit here, and they kept the fire continuously burning. And they actually took a piece of bark from a tree behind Independence Hall, not far from where we are today, and used that to start one of the fires. They also threw President Wilson's speeches in it as well. All very symbolic gestures to place pressure on the president. But as the nation entered the war in Europe, now known as World War I, these women started to be viewed as unpatriotic, and crowds started to form. Ultimately, they were arrested for charges of obstructing traffic, and they were thrown in jail, and some of them ended up in a workhouse prison outside Washington, D.C., where many of them endured horrendous conditions, and some were beaten, force-fed, and some went on hunger strikes. One of the stories that we feature is actually in a recreated jail cell to share the story of Ernestine Hara Kettler. Merely 21 years old, she picketed the White House and ended up in jail. And she talks about her experience going from the White House to this prison and ultimately enduring terrible food, terrible conditions. And in that recreated cell, you can not only hear her experience, but see it played out. We also feature the story of a Philadelphia native, Dora Kelly Lewis. She was much older than Ernestine Hara Kettler, but she went to the White House and picketed for her right to vote, and she too ended up in that workhouse prison outside Washington, D.C. We share her story by showing a letter that she wrote from prison, where she talks about the conditions. And at the very end of the letter, she includes a postscript that says Congress won't be able to stand it, and that she's delighted by that. Because all of these women making these sacrifices, being courageous, knowing that they would end up arrested and in jail, they knew what they were doing. They were placing pressure on the president, on Congress, and ultimately changing public sentiments, which pushed the public to ultimately support their cause. In the final few years of the women's suffrage movement, World War I played a very significant role. As the United States entered the war in Europe in April 1917, some suffragists paused their campaign to focus on the war effort, and they served their country as nurses, war clerks, translators, and also in munitions factories. But there were plenty of suffragists who continued their work, and they pointed out at this time in our history that we were fighting for a war for democracy abroad while leaving half the population at home without the vote. So as they continued their picketing and parading and placing pressure on President Wilson, he finally announced his support for women's suffrage as a war measure. He ultimately addressed Congress, encouraging them to pass the constitutional amendment. And that brings us to June 1919, when both houses of Congress finally passed the 19th Amendment. And now it would go to the states for ratification. By August 1920, 35 states had ratified the 19th Amendment, but one more state was needed to add it to the U.S. Constitution. Suffragists pinned their hopes on Tennessee, the next state to hold a vote. Early tallies said that the state legislature was split dead even. And the youngest legislator arrived that day, and he was wearing a red rose, indicating he would vote no. But what no one else knew was that he had just received a letter from his mother. And she encouraged him to, quote, be a good boy and vote for ratification, and signed it with lots of love, Mama. Ultimately, Harry T. Byrne voted in favor of the 19th Amendment, pushing it over the edge, and it ultimately was ratified by the 36th and final state because of his one vote. And what we see next to me is Alice Paul unfurling the ratification banner at the National Women's Party, showing 36 stars representing the 36 states that had ratified. And while millions of women celebrated the passage and ratification of the 19th Amendment, it's very important to continue the story and look at the actual text. The 19th Amendment banned voter discrimination on account of sex, which means that other forms of discrimination were able to continue. And this meant that for millions of women of color and poor women by 1920, they were subjected to literacy tests and poll taxes. And we have a poll tax receipt on display here from 1922, showing how certain people were kept from the ballot box starting in 1920. As women of color were subjected to these discriminatory laws and practices, they ultimately had to continue their suffrage fight alone. And white women who were able to vote under the 19th Amendment continued pursuing infant health legislation, special workplace protections for women, and the Equal Rights Amendment. But as women of color joined their cause with that of men of color in the civil rights movement, they continued to push for equal access to the ballot box. And by 1965, thanks to decades of organizing, they finally saw the passage of the Voting Rights Act, and they were able to vote for the first time. This is the full story, the full narrative that we try to tell here at the National Constitution Center's newest exhibit, the 19th Amendment, How Women Won the Vote.